Hyunjin are. I don't think the deputy. Ray, you're not using PowerPoint, are you? No. Vivian, are you using PowerPoint?
No.
Okay. All right. So you two. Okay. Welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Mark Moore. I'm Program Associate in the Asia program of the center, and today this program is being co-sponsored by two other divisions, which I'd like to acknowledge. First is Kent Hughes. Kent, where are you? Kent.
He's outside the door.
He's outside the door. Okay, he's head of the Science, Technology, America, and the Global Economy, a very narrow subject program, and also Philippa Strum, who I see in excellent purple jacket, thank you, who is head of our division of U.S. studies. And so it's a trifecta here, 3 for 1. And also, this program is being done in part of International Education Week of the Department of Education. And check out their website for very interesting events, I guess tomorrow and Friday also. So the title is Math and Science Teaching in Northeast Asia, Do They Do It Better? And we will see. We have 4 experts on the subject here. And my far right is Vivian Stewart, who will start off. She's Vice President for Education at the Asia Society. And there's a monograph outside. Excellent. I recommend it. It's short because it's a monograph, not a book. But it's full of good information on some exchanges that the Asia Society did with Chinese educational experts and proposals for the future. And you have there were handout sheets on the biographies, so I won't go into detail. Vivian, of course, will talk about China. Then to my right is Tadanobu Watanabe, who is Associate Professor of Mathematics Education at Kennesaw State University in Kennesaw, Georgia. And coincidentally, he will talk about the Japanese educational system. To my immediately left is Hyunjin Park, Korea Foundation Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where my son goes. But he can't, if he contacts my son, my son will be very angry at me. And Hyunjin will talk about South Korean math and science teaching. And we are very fortunate to have, on my far left, the Deputy Secretary of Education, Raymond Simon, who has been Deputy Secretary since May 26, 2005, and has a distinguished career, and also comes from Arkansas, which you'll be able to tell. It's a very distinguished accent. And Ray will back clean up today and talk about the U.S. system, our strengths and weaknesses in math and science. So we need to get started, because the sooner we start, the sooner they will finish, and you'll be able to ask questions. So Vivian,
Okay.
if you don't mind, thank you very much.
Thank you. I prefer to stand when talking. Well, I should first of all tell you that I am not a mathematician or a scientist. My field is education policy, K-12 education policy, and research. And the Asia Society, a bit like the Asia program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, has as a major role trying to promote understanding between the US and Asia along a variety of dimensions. In the education field, we work with states and schools around the US to try to get them to teach more about not just Asia, but other world regions and cultures and languages, and particularly Chinese. And in Asia, we do a lot of work to help Asian education systems learn things that they are interested in about the US. And so my comments come really from that kind of a perspective. We have taken 2 delegations of state commissioners of education to China and others to India and Singapore. And the report that was referenced, which was written by Senta Raisin, who many of you will know from the National Center on Science Education, was the result of a 2-day conference bringing together math and science educators from China and the US for a conversation about what can we learn from each other. So in that report, you'll find a lot of specific details on the curriculum, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk in sort of larger, if you like, big policy areas where there seem to be differences and areas where we can learn from each other. I guess the context is We're in a science and knowledge-based economy. Innovation is key. The US has been a leader in scientific research and innovation for many, many years, but now other parts of the world are certainly looking to play in that space and are making big investments. And that we know from some of these international science comparisons, TIMSS, and more recently PISA, that US K-12 educational performance doesn't compare with many European and Asian countries. And so the question is, why is that? We also know that we spend an awful lot of money on science education. We have invested a huge amount, beginning with Sputnik and on to today, in trying to improve K-12 science education, but we've not seen big gains in achievement. So the question is, should we just keep putting money into the same things, or do we need some fundamental rethinking? I don't propose that I have answers to that question, but that's kind of the background to the discussion. So what is it that US science educators see that's of value in the Chinese system? And many of these things are actually common to all of the East Asian systems, not just China. First, a word of context that you will all know. China is obviously, the scale of China is so much bigger. With 360 million people below the age of 18, China runs the world's largest educational system, serving 20% of the world's students, but with only 2% of the world's resources. Most of the country has 9 years of education. Their goal is to get to 12 years of education by 2015. But clearly the comments I'm going to make about the strength of the system don't apply to the most rural areas where they don't yet have upper secondary education. Probably the most striking thing about the Chinese system is that they clearly have they have a Ministry of Education, as do most other countries other than the US, that has very clear national standards in both science and math, and everything aligns to that. It's not that everything is centrally directed, but everything very clearly aligns to that. So the textbooks, there used to be just one textbook, now there are multiple textbooks, but they all link very clearly to the standards. The teacher preparation programs link to the standards. The professional development links to the standards. By contrast, as we know in the US, while we do have standards, often the university teaching of math and science doesn't relate to the K-12 standards. We have multiple state standards. Textbook manufacturers try to cater to all of them, and so they end up with telephone books worth of material that teachers have to pick and choose from. We know from Bill Schmidt's studies that even if where there are standards, they're not necessarily evenly implemented in schools. So we have a big problem of huge variation in what is taught, from the national to the state level, from the state to the district, from the district to the school, and even within the school. That's much less the case in countries that have this stronger alignment. The curriculum design in China, there is very much a core curriculum. In science, all students have to take biology, chemistry, and physics, as well as algebra and geometry. These are mandatory for completion of high school. Whereas, of course, in the US approach, while there are so many years of this and that, there's much more choice in the system, and so students tend to opt for different levels, and it's very easy for them to opt out of the harder courses. In the year 2000, nearly 40% of high school students hadn't taken any coursework in science more challenging than general biology, for example. So that's another kind of clear difference. I'm not saying that all Chinese students like having such a heavy core curriculum. That's another discussion, but it's certainly a big contrast and a big reason why you have so many more students who are competent in those subjects. The preparation and professional development of teachers is another area where there are fairly clear differences. Because math and science is so strong throughout the system, most of their teachers have math and science backgrounds, whereas, as we know, in the US compared to other countries, I think it's only around, I won't give you the percentage because I'll get it wrong, but it's somewhere around 60% of science teachers who have a science degree. That may have been going up since the highly qualified teacher provisions of No Child Left Behind. In addition, Chinese schools have specialized math and science teachers in the elementary grades. In fact, my Chinese friends who bring their students to, who move to the United States and have their children in our elementary schools, are astounded that we don't have math and science teachers in the elementary grades. They can't understand how a generalist teacher could possibly get a firm grounding in math and science. So that's a very clear, a clear difference. And there are places that are now beginning to look at that as an idea. It's actually an old idea. It used to be in US schools. There's also this tradition, which I think is true throughout much of Asia, of weekly professional development in the schools, in which master teachers work with more junior teachers to hone their lessons. So the system of teacher preparation and professional development has some clear strengths. Examinations, I guess this is kind of a mixed thing, but if you wonder why Chinese students do so well in math and science, it's because they have no choice. Because if they want to go to university, they have to take the university entrance exam. The university entrance exam is very strong in math and physics. So if you're not strong in math and physics, you don't go to university, basically. So I'm not sure that's something we would necessarily want to transfer here, but it's part of the whole focus. But what this does mean, interestingly, is that girls do just as well as boys in math and science, which we know we have that kind of gender gap here. But I also think as the US moves towards a more high-stakes testing kind of system, there are lessons to be learned from the negative effects in other countries. The final lesson, I think, is about time and academic focus. Obviously, there's a very strong cultural value on education in China, as there is in parts, but not all parts of this country. And Chinese schools really are academic institutions. They're not social institutions. They don't have sport. They don't have all of the other things that we associate with an American high school. The school day is longer. The school year is longer. It's a full month longer at the secondary level. And a number of hours of homework are astonishingly longer, so that by the end of high school, Chinese students have actually spent maybe as much as 2 years more studying than American students. I'm not saying all of this homework is good homework. Much of it is test prep. But there's certainly both the time in school and the time out of school, there's a much stronger academic focus in Chinese schools. Having said that, Chinese schools are trying to become more like American schools. So while we look at these aspects of a system that produce very strong math and science performance, and I should say on this that China has not so far participated in the PISA, the International Test of Student Achievement. They're doing it at the provincial level, but they've not yet done it at the national level. So the data we have really comes from Hong Kong and Taipei. But you can see from that how they're basically the same education system. You can see from that what the standards are. So when they look at the US system, they obviously look at the higher education system and the scientific R&D, which is outstanding. But they're also beginning to see, as their education system becomes more of a mass system, as they try to include more rural students in their system, that the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't necessarily work for everybody. And so they find the kind of second chance opportunities that we have through particularly the community college system, something that they are going to need to think about there. I would say their most fervent wish is to be able to adopt the kind of inquiry-oriented science teaching methods that we espouse and are certainly in our science and math standards, although are not always in our schools. And anybody who goes to China and has a conversation about education knows that they are in search of the pill that produces creativity, or rather the pedagogical approach that produces creativity. I think both, so in a sense, the two systems are a bit moving towards each other. We're trying to get more rigor and more alignment in the US, and the Chinese are trying to get a more modern pedagogy that is less about memorization and sort of reproduction of fairly esoteric factual bits and more about problem solving and inquiry. Both systems have enormous problems in doing that. We don't have the teaching force that has the math and science background to get the rigor, and you try overturning thousands of years of culture about a particular way to teach. That's a major professional development challenge. I think both systems feel that they would have a lot to learn from each other about assessments, because assessment is increasingly driving our systems, and I think neither country feels that we have the best possible assessment. In the Chinese case, they definitely want to move away from the kind of assessment that's really more about differentiating who should go to which university. I think both countries feel that an assessment that focuses mostly on reproduction of subject matter knowledge, which is easy to measure in multiple choice tests, is not really where we need to be pushing kids. And so there's a lot of interest in sort of problem solving and project-based assessment. As a final couple of comments on areas, because at the end of the meeting we talked about areas of common ground where there might be potential for collaborative work and to learn from each other. One is in the area of information technology. Our schools have now got a lot of technology. We spent a huge amount of money on technology, but there isn't any very clear correlation between that and academic achievement. The Chinese are certainly behind, but rapidly investing in technology, particularly to reach rural areas. And so they are interested in what uses of technology actually produce higher achievement, particularly higher achievement of this more problem-solving kind. We had a long discussion about that, which I won't go into now. And I think that the final area where neither system has all of the answers is reaching underserved populations. In the US, those tend to be more urban, although there are obviously rural ones. In the Chinese case, it's much more rural, although there's a huge rural to urban migration, which poses its own set of challenges. So I think that I will stop there, because I suspect I'm almost at my 15 minutes. But I think those conversations and this panel, in fact, are an indication of a new trend, which is that just as there are global ideas in other fields, there are also innovations in education around the world, and increasing interest in sort of what can we learn about teaching kids better from looking at other systems. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we turn to the land of the rising sun. And a PowerPoint.
Let's see if it works. Can I hit OK here? Technology person. Oh, it's asking for password. Ignore? Okay. Oh, here you go.
Excellent.
Okay, so my name is Ted Watanabe from Kennesaw State University. Kennesaw State, just in case you don't know, it's located just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. I recently moved there, a year ago. And I teach in mathematics department and work primarily with the prospective elementary teachers, but I'm in the area of mathematics education. So just a brief overview of the Japanese school system. Elementary schools covers grades 1 through 6, and basically the ages 6 through 12. Japanese kids start going to elementary school after they turn 6. And so the age-wise, it's fairly close to our American children. Then the lower secondary schools covers grades 7 through 9, and then upper secondary schools are the grades 10 through 12. And we've been told ever since we were kids that this system is really modeled after the American system. So when I first came to the United States in 1978 and looked around the schools and never saw schools that are organized in this manner, I said, where are those schools that are organized in this manner? But apparently it was the case around the time of World War II. grades 1 through 9 are the compulsory education. So there's children have to go to schools at those ages, and then 10 through 12 are non-compulsory. But I think about virtually all students do go to upper secondary schools. The compulsory education schools, they're all single track. There is no tracking at all in Japan up to that point. At the upper secondary school level, there are some tracking in the sense that there are different kinds of upper secondary schools. Some upper secondary schools are more vocational-oriented schools, so there may be some industrial trainings or the business-focused schools and so on. But I would think the vast majority of the upper secondary schools are what's called the regular high schools. In terms of the educational policies and controls, there are two levels of the educational controls, and then obviously the national level, the Ministry of Education controls the schools by establishing the national course of study, and for all subject areas. I'm not necessarily the most exciting speaker, so I have to bring in some prop to show what's it like. But this is the upper secondary school course of study. And so this booklet actually covers all subject areas for the grades 10 through 12. But then the Ministry of Education also publishes a bit more explanation for each subject area. So about the same thickness book. This one is only for the mathematics area for the upper secondary school. And these are the books that the textbook writers often reference to develop the textbooks. And this is the kind of books that you don't see much in the United States. That many states develop the state standards, but then very few, if any, state actually develops a document that try to explain what those standards meant and what are the specific mathematical ideas behind those standard statements. If anything, I think that what comes closest in this country is something like the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics' standards documents comes closest, but that document is not for any particular state standards either. So, and the Japanese, this elaboration document is much more specific. The Ministry of Education also approves textbooks. Vivian mentioned that in China there's a much stronger alignment between standards and the curriculum materials. I think part of that alignment in Asian countries probably is the fact that the Ministry of Education has this power to approve textbook series, and unless the books are approved, they cannot be used in the school settings. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that I moved to the state of Georgia last year, but one of the reasons I moved there was that their new state standards was heavily informed by the Japanese 1989 Japanese course of study. So I was very much interested in actually being in the center of what happens and when that kind of change happens. But more recently, I'm becoming more and more aware of the importance of having textbooks that are really aligned with the standards. Basically, there's no textbooks that are written for the Georgia standards. Many textbook publishers may say it matches Georgia's performance standards, but that's basically they're repackaging the textbooks that they already have, and so they put the contents. So there are the content alignments, but it's very different from the textbooks that are perhaps in China as well as in Japan and in Korea that are very much matched to the national standards, because those are the textbooks written specifically for that standards. And the Ministry of Education would not approve textbook series if a series contains some topics that are not included in that particular grade level. So if in grade 5 they're supposed to be not talking about this idea, but they included it, the publisher will be told, "Well, you scratch this off, but you will never get this approved." So there is that kind of a control, and I actually feel a bit sympathetic toward the State Department of Education folks, because the State Department of Education has really no control over publishers. State of Georgia is actually a textbook adoption state, but the adoption process is nothing like this approval process in Japan. In fact, if you have so many signatures, then that particular textbook will get onto the approved list. So, whether or not it's aligned to the standards or not. The actual day-to-day operation of schools is really controlled at the local level. elementary and lower secondary level is typically controlled by the cities or the towns level local education agencies, and upper secondary schools are controlled by the prefecture level. So let me talk a little bit more specifically about the mathematics, since I'm a mathematics educator, and I apologize if you're interested in science, because I can't really say I know too much about science education in Japan. But these are the sort of overall objectives found in the course of studies for the lower secondary school level, that the grades 7 through 9. So understanding some specific mathematical concepts, that would be the first bullet. And the second one is really talking about really mathematical processes. And it's much like what the NCTM standards talk about, contents and standards. But then the third aspect is, you can say this is more like the disposition aspects, the developing the or the appreciation for enjoying mathematical activities, or valuing this kind of a mathematical ways of thinking. So I think that's kind of interesting to see that the national standards actually set these disposition type of standards as well. Minister of Education in the course of study also sets the minimum number of lessons in each subject areas. I put the previous means that's the 1989 standards, and current standards, which was released in 2000, which, by the way, is very unpopular in Japan, and it's now in the process of being revised much sooner than typical. And typically they go about 10, 12 years before they revise the course of studies. But I understand that the new standards, new course of study, will be released before the end of the year. So you can see that the number of class lessons for the lower secondary level was reduced quite a bit from the 1989 to 2000 standards, and they're trying to bring it back to the same level as the 1989 under the new course of study. A little bit on the side, but I think at the time that when the third International Math and Science Study was released, there was some discussion about the American schools actually spending more time in mathematics instructions than Japanese students. And I'm not quite sure exactly how the researchers calculated, but if they actually combine grades 7 and 8, you can see that 105 lessons is not that much in a year. That comes out to be probably about 3 lessons a week. Japanese schools, I think, in terms of calculating the number of lessons, they use 35 instruction weeks. Here are some of the specific objectives and mathematics content, and they include numbers and algebras and geometries, and then mathematical relationships. And one of the things that you might not see here is the idea of the data analysis or the statistics. And that's probably one of the areas that the Japanese education is rather weak at. They do not do much in the area of data analysis or statistics. And I think there is some movement in Japan amongst the math educators to try to incorporate more of that aspects into school mathematics. And grade 8, you see things like the simultaneous linear equations, and the grade 8 is one of the big topic in grade 8 is really learning geometric proofs. And this is one area when I saw in the Georgia standards that they did not actually push for the proofs in grade 8, and I think they put that proofs into grade 9. So there are some changes there. And you see finally the probability discussed in grade 8 here. They don't do very little in the area of probability in the Japanese elementary school. In part because they say, well, the children don't know much about proportional way of thinking. How can you actually talk about probability? And the grade 9, this is the last year of the lower secondary schools, where they do things like quadratic equations and Pythagorean theorems and simple quadratic functions. And some of these topics are typical, and quadratic equations are oftentimes thought of as like a typical topic in Algebra 2 topics in this country, which nowadays could be grade 10 or grade 11 mathematics topic. In the upper secondary school, the course of study actually defines the courses, types of mathematics courses. In 1989, they had 6 courses, Math 1, 2, 3, and Math A, B, and C. This was very descriptive of the content. But then in the current standards, they have, in addition to those 6 courses, they have fundamentals of foundation. fundamental ideas of mathematics, and these numbers in the parentheses are the units, and it basically corresponds to the number of lessons per week. 1 unit means the 35 lessons, and so if you have one lesson a week for 35 weeks, that's 1 unit. And then you can see the planned change. They would eliminate the mathematics C as well as the fundamental ideas of mathematics and replace that with mathematics applications. Then the course of study actually suggests these different sequencing of topics, and they suggest the 2000 course of study. They said, well, typically you can take Math 1 and A during your 10th grade year, and then they can go on to take Math 2 and B. Of course, it turns out the only required mathematics course in the course of study is Mathematics 1 or the fundamental ideas of mathematics. So students can actually stop taking mathematics course at the end after they take the Mathematics 1 or the foundational ideas of mathematics. But most schools do offer the Mathematics 2 and actually make students take Mathematics 2 and so on. And actually, I was a little bit surprised about this requirement because when I look back my own high school days, basically all of my friends took up to Math 2 with me. And back then, there was only 3 courses, Math 1, 2, and 3. And all of us took Math 1 and 2 together, and then it was during the last year of the high schools that we split into the math science track and the humanities track. So I went back and looked at the past course of studies, and it seems like it has always been that the Math 1 is the only required mathematics course. But in practice, in high school settings, I think most schools actually made students take additional courses. So I went and looked at the number of books that are published by these various publishers on these areas and used that as a sort of proxy to determine the approximate percentage of the students taking these various courses. Since Math 1 and Fundamental Ideas of Mathematics are the required courses, if you add those two numbers together, that should come very close to the number of students, the 10th grade students. So I use that as the 100. So as you can see, virtually all students take Math 1. And about three quarters take Math A along with Math 1. And you can also see about 3/4 of students do take Math 2 as well. So, but you can see that the Mathematics 3 and Math C are taken by only about 1/5 of students. And that's one of the big concerns amongst the Japanese math educators, that the number of students who are pursuing math and science-related fields are declining, or they'd like to see more and more of. So that's a major concern for Japanese math educators. Just briefly, the content of those courses. You can tell what these are. One of the things in the grade 10, the Math 1, is they talk about trigonometric ratios, and they mean by trigonometric ratios not trigonometric functions, because that's a topic actually studied in Math 2. They make the distinction between those two ideas. But they talk about geometry, logic, and the probabilities, and basically the permutations and combinations in Mathematics A as well. And in Mathematics 2, which is taken by about 3/4 of students, do include some basic ideas of differentiation and integration. So about 3/4 of Japanese students who go through the regular high schools and take Math 2 would have seen some basic ideas of calculus before they finish high school. Then Mathematics B, sequences, vectors, statistics, and computers. The statistics is finally getting discussed more in these areas. Then Math 3 is much more into the differentiation and integrations and calculus ideas. One of the things that I found interesting is ideas like matrices are discussed in these optional courses. I have a son who is in the Algebra 2 class this year, and they're actually looking at the matrices in Algebra 2 classes, and I found that to be a sort of an interesting contrast, that they include some of the topics in Japan are optional in these typical courses for the high school students in this country. Mathematics teaching in a secondary school. As the grade level goes up, the teaching tends to become more teacher-directed. technology uses very limited, both in terms of computers as well as the calculators, like the graphing calculators. I think there is some interest amongst the mathematics teachers to incorporate these technology more into their classrooms, but they want to do it so that they can really take advantage of those technologies. And sometimes we see in this country that we use technology for the sake of using technology without necessarily carefully examining the usefulness of technology in teaching mathematics. But you also see, even at the upper secondary school level, the kind of activities that you may have seen in the videotaped Japanese lessons, where the students are asked to go up to the blackboard and share their work publicly and actually discuss those solutions. And board writing is always a very important consideration for Japanese teachers, which in this country, we don't seem to pay too much attention to the board writing as an instructional tool. Mathematics textbooks, I think, is probably one of the big difference between the United States and Japan, and perhaps between the United States and East Asian countries. They tend to be much more concise. These are the 6 books for the 6 subject areas in mathematics. When is the last time you could actually hold all the high school math course textbooks in one hand in this country? I mean, you have a hard time to pick up one textbook in one hand. It's produced by commercial publishers, but ministry approval is required. Lower secondary schools, you still see a lot of those problem-solving centered approach. So you see that in this page, the problem with the big Q mark is that's really the central question. This is the very beginning page of the study of linear functions, but they start with the problems, and they solve the problems, and they really teach through problems. Again, this is on the parallelograms in grade 8 and talking about proofs. You also see that they're starting with the problems. But the upper secondary school level textbooks tend to be a bit more, for the lack of a better word, traditional. So this is in grade 10 textbooks. But they start with the discussion and the worked out examples, and then they define provide some exercise problems. So it's very different. Let me say that one thing about testing, since it seems like testing is such an important topic in this country, but there is no mandatory standardized test in Japan. And in fact, if any Japanese educational policymaker makes a statement like, well, if you don't test them, how do you know what your students understand? They'll be offended. And I think American teachers should be offended by that statement too. They know, I mean, that's part of their profession. They're professionals to know what their students do understand and don't understand. Social promotion is known during the compulsory education ages, and to some degree even at the upper secondary level. The examinations do play a huge role, but the examinations that play roles are the entrance exams, both high school entrance exams and the college entrance exam. Dick Askey sent me this website where you can actually look at the Japanese university entrance exam. And I have written a short piece for the mathematics teacher back in 2000 on high school entrance exams. So if you're interested in, you can look at those materials. But I do caution you making too much out of these examination questions, because examination has a very specific role, which is to screen out the students. So I don't think they have any anticipation that all students should be able to solve these problems. In fact, all students can solve those problems. That question is not useful for the purpose of entrance exams. So I do caution, keep that in mind as you look at these entrance exam problems. But entrance exam problems are indeed very interesting. So I guess that's where I stop. I think I may have gone a little over time.
Thank you. Okay, next up we will turn to Korea with Professor Park.
Okay. I'm a sociologist who studies sociology education. So today I'm just trying to give a little broad picture of the math and science education from perspective of sociologists rather than like a math and science teaching perspective. In other words, I'm more interested in how Korean educations actually deal with disadvantaged students compared to other countries to actually have them to have the minimum level of the literacy skills at a given level of grade and or age. So what do we know about Korean education? We know a lot about the higher average score of Korean students on various international math and science tests. Actually, it's quite interesting that those kind of higher average score of Korean students are consistent actually across different survey of international comparison. Third International Math and Science Studies conducted in 1995 and to 2003, and also PISA, which was actually conducted 2003. Across all these kind of different survey, actually Korean students actually outperform their peers in any other country, especially compared to the US and Western country. Also, this kind of higher average score of Korean students also is consistently found across different grades. So it's not only for primary school students, but also actually secondary school students are doing well compared to other countries. Also, it's not only for math and science. Actually, Korean students are doing across different subjects, math, science, and reading. So I think, that we pretty much, all the, especially U.S. media is so kind of interested in this kind of, higher performance of Korean students, and try to understand, explores, where this kind of higher average performance of Korean students come from. Actually, one reaction to this kind of higher performance of Korean education, spread U.S. policy perspective, is that American education should adopt a feature of East Asian education. I'm here more generally talking about the East Asian education, including Korean. So, for example, they are trying to look at the pedagogical practice, textbook, as we saw, and try to, see the, whether, how, to what extent we can kind of, learn from that kind of pedagogical practice and teaching method. But I have to tell you that it is really kind of difficult to, because there's a lot of differences in social context, it is very difficult to adapt certain features or a certain kind of practice of pedagogies from one country to another country without taking into account such a diversities in context. But another actual reaction to this kind of, the higher performance of Korean students is actually they don't pay attention to this kind of trend. Some U.S. policymakers are actually very critical about this higher average performance of Korean students as simply reflecting drill, memorization, and standard testing. So even they argue that we wouldn't benefit from one that idealized high test score, like Korea. It could put our very competitiveness as a nation at risk. So forget about Korean students. They are just, they're doing drill, memorization, and rote learning. So they are doing well. So extreme, between these two kind of extreme, actually, the reaction to Korean students' higher performance, what actually we need to know is actually we have to kind of step back from this kind of two extreme reactions. Think about where does such a higher performance of Korean students come from. So as I already talked about, some people are interested in pedagogical, but also we may wonder, what kind of educational or cultural factors might, kind of relate to this kind of the higher performance of Korean students. But in order to do that, actually we need to look at more carefully the distribution of academic achievement to identify where in the distribution actually Korean students show strengths and weakness in math and science. So far, most interest actually was on the average score, without actually taking careful look at about the distribution of student score. By actually looking at the distribution, we actually can have a better idea about where actually Korean students are doing well. Is that because Korean top students are doing well? Or is it because Korean bottom students are doing better than bottom students in other country? So, this is kind of one motivation of my research to look at kind of distribution of academic performance of students rather than focusing on this, kind of average score. Before showing some kind of distribution, let me talk a little bit of a feature of secondary education in Korea so that, you can have some kind of background information. Korean education has no school differentiation at the middle school, in lower secondary school, which is actually comprehensive school system. And actually there's no ability grouping In other words, there's no within-school tracking at the middle school level. All kids, regardless of their ability, actually sit in the same classroom and they use the same textbook. But after graduation from middle school, students are differentiated into academic and vocational high school. So actually, the academic high schools are more prestige than the vocational high school, and about 70% of the high school students in Korea actually attend the academic school. Korea's education system is pretty much in a highly standardized system in terms of uniform textbook and teaching method across school. Actually, Korean government is very involved in this, to control education. So even actually public school students actually rotate every 5 years across school, so that actually Korean government try to kind of make a school equal, in terms of the the teachers' qualities as well as actually learning method. Okay, so then where does the higher average come from in the distribution? One actually criticism on highly standardized education system of Korea argued that in Korean highly standardized system, like in Korea, talented students in standardized education do not have opportunity of advanced learning, but have to suffer from uniform curriculum and pace of instruction designed for average students, right? Because every kid, regardless of their abilities, sit in the same classroom and use the same textbook under the same teacher. So that actually, there's a possibility actually, talented students, in other words, top students may not learn as much as top students in other country where there's a very diverse in terms of ability grouping. Is that really true? OECD actually conducted a survey of 15-year-old students, math, science, actually reading in 2000. The survey called the PISA, and they actually, include a variety of number of countries so that we can kind of compare the distribution of students' outcome. Okay, this red line indicates this distribution of U.S. students. So this is a cumulative percentage. Okay, the way in which you read this figure is like this. Here, the top 90% indicate the top 10% in the United States score above 600. Right? If you draw the line, probably a little less than 600. And the blue line is indicate Korea. So top 10% in Korea actually scored like a 620 point, which is much larger than top 10% in the United States, right? And let's take a look at the bottom 20% in the United States, which is scored a 400 point, but the bottom 20% in Korea actually scores about 470. Right? Actually, the gap between students in the top compared to the low, actually the difference is much larger among low achieving students, right? The distribution actually increased, as you can see that, as we go to the, bottom students. In other words, actually Korean education is quite interesting compared to the U.S. system. First, actually, top students in Korea, yes, actually they are doing better top students in the United States. Bottom students in Korea, they are doing much, much better than bottom students in the United States. In other words, actually Korean education system is much better to have low achieving students to have certain minimum level of literacy skills at age 15 than the American system. Finland, you can see that, these, what the green lines indicate Finland. Finland is one of the top countries in PISA that shows a higher performance and also lower variabilities among students' outcome. So actually, Korea is very close to Finland. In other words, Korea and Finland shows that there's a possibility to combine higher average performance with low variabilities of the students' performance. So in other words, higher achieving test score is not driven by just top students, but actually some education system can work to achieve both kind of outcomes of education. Here you see the Japan. Japan is also pretty much similar to what you can see in Korea. Similar pattern for the science test. Again, the top students in Korea doing better than top students in the United States, and actually bottom students in Korea much better than the bottom students in the United States. Okay, this is another kind of looking at the score by the parents' socioeconomic background that sociologists always kind of like to look at. So one of the main indicators I have used here is the mother's education. See, the 576 scores indicate the average score of students whose mother have tertiary education, junior college, or the 4 years university education. Look at this, 528 in the United States whose mothers actually have a tertiary education, right? The gap between the the students whose mother actually graduated from college versus actually didn't graduate from high school is much larger in the United States than in Korea, right? So in other words, a smaller variation in students' outcome in Korea, as you saw in the graph, indicate that even in terms of socioeconomic background, actually the social impact of economic status on students' outcome is much weaker in Korea than in the United States. Okay. So how can we actually interpret this finding? I actually have done some research to look at how the feature of education system in Korea actually have this kind of impact on the pattern that you just saw. So Korean education requires mastery of core academic curriculum to all students may decrease socioeconomic inequality in educational performance by reducing the gap in exposure to academic subjects between students from high and low socioeconomic status. One of the most important things in the United States is actually high SES kids take advanced math and science, and low SES kids actually do not take such a high level of math and science, which affect their eventual chance for going college. But in Korea, actually this kind of minimum level of standardized education requires all students to take some kind of the basic the math and science course, so that help the low achieving kid to keep certain level of achievement. So do you still believe that Korean education highly rely on rote learning, memorization, and lack of creativity? You can see this kind of criticisms all of the U.S. kind of mass medias and articles. But actually, despite these worst average scores, so these policymakers argue that American education is still the best because it emphasizes problem-solving skills and creativity. We don't teach students to take a test, but we teach to students learn creativity and problem-solving skill. Is that really true? No, right? How do I know it's no? Because in PISA actually 2003, interesting enough, they surveyed called the problem-solving skill. It is not a measure of math and science, but it is kind of measure of students' ability to understand problem situations, identify relevant information or constraint, and check or reflect on the solutions, communicate the solution and reasoning behind it. Because of the time limit, I can't show some more, but here's a kind of example of what the problem-solving skill is. You can see that this kind of question, community service organized 5 children's camp, 46 children have signed up for the camp, and 8 others have volunteered to attend organized camp. The question is, fill the table to allocate 46 children and 8 adults to dormitory, keeping all the rules. So this is not a test of math and science on the base of curriculum, but it is the question of problem-solving skill, and the pattern is exactly the same what you saw in the math and science. Top students in Korea do much better than top students in the United States, and bottom students in Korea do much better than the bottom students in the United States in terms of problem-solving skill. Yes, Korean students are more creative and more capable of problem-solving than U.S. kids, not only for math and science. Here's actually another interesting change. If you actually look at Japan, which I don't have time, so I have to stop here. But Japan actually has a little change over time because of this, the curriculum change. Now Korea and Japan are more likely to introduce called the individualities and integrated learning away from the standardized education. which makes actually worse their system in terms of the gap between low-end achievement to students. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you, Professor Pak. And now with the tough task of batting cleanup, the Deputy Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I began my educational career 41 years ago as a high school math teacher. It was 1966. The slide rule was king. There was an active movement to convert our measurement system to metric, and new math dominated our textbooks. Teachers of math and science still reveled in this nation's historic investment in those subjects following the launching of the Soviet satellite Sputnik just 9 years earlier. That singular event in 1957 sparked a space race that forced the government and the public to take a closer look at America's educational system to see if it could better meet the needs of its students in an increasingly scientific and technological world. America's space program was in high gear, working toward the goal that President Kennedy had set for this country to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. The new math, which brought such advanced topics as set theory and number theory to our elementary and secondary classrooms, was supposed to get us a generation of mathematicians and scientists to make sure that our dominance in those disciplines was assured. My experience with it was that it was an interesting phenomenon, that where higher achieving kids did okay, but a lot of kids just didn't get it. Over the past 41 years, I've seen a lot of things come and go and come again. Math and science education has had its share of experiments in what to do, in what to teach, and how to teach. Too often, curriculum has been driven by fads of the day or by a desire for a quick fix to a real or imagined problem. I will address what I believe to be two of the most significant factors influencing our potential to provide our students today with the very best opportunity to globally compete in these disciplines: our collective cultural attitude toward math and science, and our level of respect, support, and encouragement for the teaching profession. Regarding the first, Americans have for far too long convinced ourselves that some of our children just won't do well in mathematics and science. Specifically, girls, children of color, poor kids, or kids of parents who did not do well in math and science when they were in school. A study by Public Agenda research organization revealed that students don't see the relevance of math and science in their lives. Most found these subjects boring, yet a majority of their parents say their kids are learning enough about these subjects. Parents and students alike said high-level math and science were only for those wanting to be doctors or scientists. Other surveys and data analysis yield similar results. Consider the following. On both TIMSS and PISA, as already been pointed out, U.S. student performance substantially lags behind many of our international peers at all grade levels tested. The rankings get worse when only compared to a smaller subset of industrialized nations. A just-released report from the American Institutes for Research show that in math and science, even students in America's highest-performing states rank well below their counterparts in other top-achieving countries. The report further calls for more emphasis in math and science in the early grades, with the hope that this will encourage more students to consider careers in math and science fields. Girls comprise only 1/3 of AP Physics and 15% of AP Computer Science classes. They represent less than 20% of engineering majors in college, and the number of females with computer science degrees has dropped 25% since 1985. Less than half of our students graduate from high school ready for college-level math and science. 500,000 students were ready for AP Calculus last year but didn't take it or have the opportunity to take it. 84% of middle schoolers would rather clean their rooms, take out the garbage, or go to the dentist than do their math homework. While adults don't brag that they can't read, it sometimes seems like a badge of honor for them to say, well, I'm no good in math. It's time for an attitude adjustment. That adjustment is already underway, fueled in large part by No Child Left Behind, National Initiative in Reading and Math, in partnership with state and local school reform efforts. The law says that all children regardless of sex, skin color, or zip code, should be held to high standards and should be expected to be at grade level in these subjects. This school year marks the beginning of the requirement that science testing be added to various grade spans with results reported to parents and the general public. In 1966, learning standards were almost exclusively teacher-based. What went on in the classroom stayed in the classroom. I had a textbook, my brains, the brains of my students, and my lesson plans. My standards were not necessarily those of the teacher next door that taught the same subject. As long as I covered the textbook or major portion thereof and did it in a way that maintained a quiet, orderly classroom, no one really cared. In 2007, learning standards in this country are state-based, with every teacher of the same subject in the same state expected to impart those standards to all the children in his or her classroom. Standards-based teaching and learning, which really caught fire as a movement in the 1990s, is now the law of the land. The most recent results from the 2007 administration of the National Assessment of Educational Progress, our nation's report card, show the law is working, with highest ever scores in math specifically, with the achievement gaps narrowing. To help improve upon and expand these promising results, President Bush has proposed to significant additional funding for the American Competitiveness Initiative, a comprehensive measured approach to improving math and science education and building a competitive workforce for the 21st century. It would draw on proven instructional methods to prepare elementary school teachers, students, for more rigorous courses in middle and high school, help students who have fallen behind in middle school to catch up, raise expectations for high school students to take and pass challenging advanced placement and international baccalaureate classes, and streamline federal math and science education programs and align them with NCLB accountability principles. The President, in April of 2006, established the National Mathematics Advisory Panel to review the best scientific evidence and make recommendations on improving mathematics education, with an emphasis on readiness for and success in algebra. The panel consists of 24 experts, including mathematicians, cognitive psychologists, mathematics educators, a current classroom teacher, policymakers, and 5 ex officio members of federal agencies with programs in mathematics education. 2 members of the panel are with me today as my special guests, and they'll certainly be available to answer any questions you might fire at me that I don't know. Skip Fennell, who is president of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, and Vern Williams, who is a middle school mathematics teacher at Longfellow Middle School in Fairfax, Virginia. And thank you, gentlemen, for being with me today. Although the final report of the math panel is due to be published in February of 2008, is still being debated by the panel and is not yet ready for release, some interesting facts have already emerged from their discussions, including the following. In comparison to children in many other nations, it takes U.S. children many more years to become fast and efficient at solving basic arithmetic problems. By the end of elementary school, the majority of children do not appear to understand many basic concepts. Fractions are formally introduced in elementary school, yet remain difficult for many adults. The teaching of fractions must be acknowledged as critically important and improved before an increase in student achievement in algebra can be expected. Relative to children in nations with high mathematics achievement, children in the U.S. tend to attribute mathematical achievement more to ability than effort, which says again something about our cultural attitudes that I mentioned earlier. Experimental studies have demonstrated that children's beliefs about the relative importance of effort and ability can be changed, and that increased emphasis on the importance of effort is related to improved mathematics grades. Since the early 90s, the number of mathematics teachers leaving the profession has been greater than the number entering. By some estimates, there will be a shortage of more than 280,000 math and science teachers by 2015. 25% of teachers certified in other content areas are currently teaching math. And the shortage of highly qualified math teachers is especially critical in high-poverty, high-minority schools, where students have a 50% chance of getting teachers in math who hold neither a license nor a degree in the field, and where the teacher turnover rate is twice as high as in low-poverty schools. For these same schools in science, only about 1/3 of the teachers majored or minored in the field they're teaching. A substantial part of variability in student achievement gains is due to who the teacher is. The panel's intent is to list the major topics of school algebra, as well as the prerequisite essential concepts and skills necessary at the elementary and middle grades. It will talk about how students acquire knowledge and skills needed to learn algebra, how teachers can facilitate learning, and how they can be supported to do so. It will review instructional materials and practices, look at assessments of mathematics learning, and issue a number of findings and recommendations. Although the specific findings and recommendations are yet to be finalized, some currently being considered include: teach for mastery in a few topics instead of a mile-wide, inch-deep curriculum. Benchmark skills at critical grade levels should guide classroom curriculum, mathematics instruction, and state assessments. Federal and state policy should give incentives for schools to offer access to an authentic Algebra 1 course in grade 8. Adequate preparation of students for algebra requires their teachers to have a strong mathematics background. U.S. students' performance in solving arithmetic problems with speed and efficiency lags behind that of students in a number of other countries. Empirical studies comparing the U.S. and China, for example, suggest the lag is related to differences in the frequency and organization of problem practice. Teachers' content knowledge is a positive factor in student achievement. And this is a surprising one for me. Although evidence shows that a substantial part of gains in student achievement is due to who the teacher is, it is less clear from the evidence exactly what it is about particular teachers, what they know and do that makes them more effective. We also don't know what particular features of teacher preparation or professional development actually produce changes in teachers' knowledge or their students' learning. Stay tuned for the final report. You will see a very thoughtful, practical, well-researched blueprint for teaching and learning mathematics that we had all better pay attention to. 50 years after Sputnik, we no longer are engaged in a Cold War era space race, and we have no symbol as obvious as a Russian satellite to remind us of our global competitors. For the United States or any other nation to beat the demands of an increasingly scientific and technological world, it must provide the educational opportunities in math and science its citizens need to succeed in the global-based economy. We must now decide if we're really serious about sustaining the gains of the past few years and capitalizing on the renewed interest in math and science that the knowledge of the flat world has generated. All of this progress, all of this interest will not sustain or rise to the necessary level of response until this country acknowledges in a very tangible way the respect, support, and encouragement that is due our teachers. No Child Left Behind reinforces this importance of teachers by requiring that highly qualified teachers be available to all children, with immediate efforts undertaken to help ensure that such teachers be distributed equally among the classrooms of poor children and their more affluent counterparts. Suggested changes to the law refocus this requirement to include highly effective teachers as well. The work of the National Math Panel and others has clearly demonstrated that good teaching is at the heart of good learning. Too many of our good teachers leave the profession within 3 to 5 years because they don't feel respected and they don't feel they have the support of their administrators to help them help their kids learn. Many, but not most, leave because of more attractive salary opportunities elsewhere. Not surprisingly, of those who do leave for higher pay, a greater percentage are math and science teachers. It should not be the luck of the draw for any child to get a highly qualified, effective teacher in this country. All children deserve to have the teacher of the year every year, to go to a blue ribbon school and to have a principal of the year in charge of that school. We must invest heavily in incentives, both financial and otherwise, to keep good teachers teaching. This means investing in the research necessary to find out just what it is that makes a highly effective teacher highly effective, and then bringing that to scale. This means investing in a system of effective and reliable pre-service education and ongoing professional development for teachers that prepares them for the real work of teaching kids. This means raising the salaries for math and science teachers so they're more competitive with salaries in similar non-teaching fields. This means higher pay for teachers willing to work in schools or geographic areas that have difficulty attracting quality staff. It means higher pay for teachers with a demonstrated record of raising student achievement. It means insisting that our teachers have in their hands more and better scientifically based research on how students learn and how effective instruction and assessment can enhance their efforts. This, above all, means in many cases giving the status quo the heave-ho. I've had a chance to visit a lot of schools and talk to a lot of leaders throughout this nation and world since my coming to Washington. I can tell you that education and the search for qualified, effective school leaders and teachers is on the minds of many, many people. The most poignant of my conversations was with the Minister of Education from Rwanda, Romain Murenzi, where his country measures education reforms as before and after the genocide, where over 1 million citizens were murdered. He told me the killers were uneducated. He sees education as the single most important initiative to help ensure that such an atrocity will not happen there again. Schools will be the most visible structure throughout the country, the center of local communities, and a symbol of the best hope for the future. The schools will all focus on science and technology. I think they have a chance to pull this off because you see their education minister at the time, who is now their minister in the office of the president in charge of science, technology, and scientific research, has a PhD in physics. That one encounter drove home to me more than any other experience I can remember just how much our investment in education is really an investment in individual futures. It is the one single most important use of capital, human, financial, political, or moral, that we can ever imagine. What a great time to be in the futures business. In listening to my colleagues and trying to fit together what we're doing in this country as opposed to what they're doing, I gathered this very quickly. In China, I see that, I heard today that teacher preparation and professional development are very central. That teachers have access to mentor teachers on a very routine basis. That the culture values education. There's more rigor in courses. Our own kids in this country tell us when they leave high school, more could have been expected of us. They expect much of their children in China. Japan, same thing. Rigorous coursework, teacher-directed teaching, textbooks, very small. Teachers know the material and how to teach it. Sometimes I wonder why our textbooks have gotten so large. Is it to help the kids or to help the teachers? And when you see the fact that in many of our schools, especially our poor schools, when the teachers themselves aren't prepared, is the textbook for them or for the student? And in Korea, I gathered from that it's difficult to say what works in one country will automatically transfer to another. There's so many sociological events involved here and considerations involved. That's why I believe while we can learn from other countries, it gets down to the two things that I talked about and tried to emphasize in my remarks. One is high expectations for kids and a culture that values strong education and a respect and support for teachers. If we don't get those two things straight, there's no hope for anything else. It doesn't do any good to go to school 2 more hours a day if the teachers are not prepared and if we don't value the education that occurs during those 2 hours. I don't worry as much about time as I do the quality of what goes into that classroom. And I have been a teacher of one sort or another, I'll say it again, for 41 years. And if we can't support our teachers, then we might as well close the doors and go about some other business, which you know we're not going to do in this country. School is the center of our country. It is the cultural center of our country. And that has some advantages. Schools will come to the rescue of kids when others can't. We've fed kids when they're hungry. We've taken care of them when they're sick. So we have a lot to be proud of in this country for what our school systems do. But we have a long way to go when it comes, in many cases, when it comes to teaching our children and having expectations of academic achievement for them. We have millions of outstanding teachers and thousands of outstanding schools in our country. Our biggest challenge is to, again, bring that to scale and let every child have access to that, not just a certain lucky percentage. That's the message I'd like to leave with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary Simon. I think all of us have had the experience of being children in a household, and most of us here have had the experience of being parents. we all went to school. And I was really moved by your comments. And I was a Peace Corps volunteer, a teacher in Korea in the mid-'60s. And every time on the street, one of the students from my middle school saw me, they were required to stand still and bow as a sign of respect. Of course, if they were children from other schools, they could run me over with their bicycles. But I think that it goes, we are talking about culture, and I couldn't agree with you more. There's a Confucian tradition, and it's coming back in China, that there is a fundamental respect for teachers. Teachers matter in Korea and China and Japan, and that's one advantage that they have to start with. But I thank you, Mr. Secretary, for pointing out what we need to do in this country to get back to perhaps where we once were, or to match the kind of cultural values in Northeast Asia for the importance of education. Confucius may have lived 2,400 years ago, but he wasn't all wrong. And with that, let's open it up for questions. Our speakers were most judicious in obeying the time rules for this session. And so we have ample time for Q's and A's. I'd just like to ask you, since we are on the web, that you wait for the microphone, identify yourself and your organization so that people in their laptops on their couch sofas throughout the country know who you are, and keep it sort of simple. No merved questions to begin with. Keep them simple. And with that, anybody like to start? The gentleman, Dr. Hughes.
I'm Kent Hughes here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Mr. Secretary, I was struck by your image of the slide rule. I can remember those days myself. And a certain subset of students who wore the slide rule on their belt, but they weren't the kids that were really cool or popular or destined to take the cheerleader to the prom and that sort of thing. How do we change that culture? If you get what you respect, how do we get respecting the right things in American culture?
Well, I mean, that's obviously a tough call because of the non-school influences that our children have. Our kids watch, I think the average now is 27 hours a week of television, where they see basically human life depicted as not worth very much. We lack role models in this country, the kind of role models I would want my children to look for. By the way, I have one child, an adult child, who's a biomedical engineer. She's one of the girls that broke the mold. Inherited her mother's intelligence and my looks. So she's very fortunate in 2 ways. I think the fact that, again, No Child Left Behind is, I want to emphasize the partnership that it has right now with states and local communities. No Child Left Behind didn't invent standards-based teaching and learning. That was around before No Child Left Behind. But what No Child Left Behind has tried to say is, what's good for some kids is good for all kids. And our expectations, it's trying to turn this culture around, that some kids can get it and some kids can't. We're seeing that in schools where we're seeing that actually happen, where teachers are allowed to teach and principals are allowed to work on what's important for kids. We see attitudes changing. It's not necessarily the kids that would now wear the slide rules are the geeks. Everybody's in the same, has the same expectations. We want everybody to be able to use the equivalent of a slide rule. I have a little speech I give to unfortunately, we have too many kids that graduate from high schools that all they know how to do is use a slide rule in a, metaphorically, in a way that when they need a calculator. So high expectations for kids, it's got to start there. It's got to start there. And I think that's our biggest hope. And teachers have already, by a number of studies will show that teachers are the single most important influence on what a kid learns. His family background, what he watches on television, what she watches on television, all that has influence. But a teacher can still influence a child's learning more than any single thing.
Sir.
should say. All right, I'm Jerome Dancis. I'm a retired math professor, and to pick up on your last statement, I mean certainly the teacher in the classroom is crucial, and what they know is crucial, and perhaps probably the reason that the Chinese and the Korean students are doing better is because their countries cheat because they insist that the teachers actually know the math, and we don't do that, and the number one problem we have is that, say, middle school math teachers do not know decimals and fractions. And it was supposed to be No Child Left Behind to the rescue, which says that middle school math teachers have to be highly qualified in math. And then, but there was a loophole, and the loophole is that it was the states that get to set the standards, and many states use Praxis 2. And the first rule of the Praxis 2 math content test for teachers is that the middle school teachers get to use calculators, so they don't have to know decimals and fractions. So hopefully when No Child Left Behind is modified, there'll be a rule that the middle school math teachers not only have a title of highly qualified, but they'll also have to know decimals and fractions. And I'll let you comment on.
Oh, okay, I guess that was a comment. Do you have a question?
Oh, I had another comment.
Oh, no, that's okay. Somebody, Flip, and yeah, Flip.
Thank you. Philippa Strum. I'm from the Wilson Center. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for your comments, for your emphasis on teachers and getting talented teachers and supporting talented teachers. I'm thinking of my father's generation. He was a public school teacher all of his life because at the time of the Depression, that was a good field to go into, and a lot of very talented people went into that field. You don't find the same thing happening today, and I'm wondering if the other members of the panel might give us some information about what is the relative economic well-being of teachers as compared with people in other professions. Is that a factor in the very good teaching that seems to be taking place in those three countries as compared to the United States?
Well, excuse me. Speaking of China, I don't think it's just that. I think that math and science is so broad in the culture that almost whoever you get in the classroom is going to have a good basic background. So, but on the economics of it, teachers are paid at sort of the civil service kind of level. So it's a good middle class. You're not going to get rich like the Chinese entrepreneurs, but it's a stable profession, and it's a respected profession. I have heard in places like Singapore, for example, which also do very well in math, that as the Singapore economy is changing, they are running into problems getting the people to go into teaching that they used to have. So that there's definitely sort of an economic issue at work here in terms of the relative pay rates of teachers. But the comparative studies of teaching I've seen don't actually suggest, even though I do believe we should pay teachers more, that the pay levels of teachers are the critical factor in whether people go into teaching or not. But I don't know all of the literature on that.
Tad.
I think there are actually statistics showing the Japanese teachers' pay scale, but I'm not too familiar with that. But I think it's like in China. I think the public school teachers are civil servants, and I think they will probably be considered as the slightly better than middle class status. But like in China, I think the Japanese teachers are very much respected profession. I do see some changes in the Japanese society, which I think is probably one of their biggest potential pitfalls for their future education, is that I start seeing a little bit more of these public bashing of teachers in media. And I think that does no good in terms of trying to improve education, and I think that's a major concern I see in this country as well. I think too many people bash teachers. Even though they may deserve some of the bashings, I think we can deal with those things in a more professional way than try to do it in public.
Yes, the teachers in Korea, the occupation as an occupation is I have to say that's pretty good occupational category, especially for women. And actually, in the marriage market, actually the teachers is one of the most kind of preferable the occupational category, even the marriage market, because all of the Korean teachers should graduate from 4 years college. So, for example, Seoul National University, which is one of the top universities in Korea, has a normal school, which for the secondary school teachers. So they actually have very high qualified in a sense, and also they have passed the national test to become a teacher. So in a sense, I mean, it's quite standardized, and actually, the government's actually quite involved in control and actually pay well. So in terms of stability, especially for women, the lots of women in Korea actually quit their job around childbearing time, but actually teachers can stay, and actually they have a good benefit in terms of pensions. So actually, they enjoy pretty much good quality of the life as the teachers. So I think that's one of the important factors to factor students' achievement.
And let me just make sure you understand my position. Money is not what drives most teachers away from teaching, at least in the first few years of teaching. It's lack of respect and lack of support from their administrators. That's what drives them away. The issue of higher pay, we're going to have to address for certain classes, categories of teachers, including math and science teachers. Math and science teachers can make quite a bit more money elsewhere, and they're going in larger numbers. We need to pay teachers more for effective teachers for raising student achievement. We have to pay them to go to poorer areas where sometimes teachers don't want to go for whatever reason. We're going to have to start looking at different ways, financial and otherwise, of getting some teachers to places they're not now. Teach for America, for example, I think has had one of their best recruiting years ever. So it's not that people don't want to teach. And these are mid-level or career people that probably could make a whole lot more than teaching. They're signing up for Teach for America in record numbers.
Could you say a little bit more about Teachers for America? Teach
for America is it's a organization that recruits non-standard applicants for teaching. They go out into the business world, industrial world, and they train their own teachers. They'll generally go into areas that I'm saying we need good teachers and sign up for a couple of years, 2 years, I think. In Arkansas, we couldn't have opened some of our schools if we didn't have Teach for America teachers there. We loved them, and they were great teachers. And I'm going to tell you, if you ever want to be energized, go to a Teach for America teacher meeting when they have national meetings. I was invited to one on a Friday night, one cold fall night. I had to drive 2.5 hours, and I didn't want to go, and I told my deputy when I was back in Arkansas, I was, "Oh, Woody, go with me. I don't want to go here it's Friday night." So we both, went over there with chips on our shoulders. And I didn't want to leave when I got over there. I know you don't have Walmart around here, but it's like a Walmart rally, if you've ever seen one of those on television. They were cheering and going on with one another and fired up, and they make a difference with kids. And we in Arkansas, when I left, I don't know if it's changed, but we agreed if a person came to Arkansas and spent 2 years in Teach for America, we would automatically give them a teaching license.
How long has that program been in existence?
Sir, I'm not familiar. It's been several years, but I couldn't give you the details. But there's
at least 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just a personal commercial for me. I'm not on their board or don't get any money from them. That's just a personal. I use that as an illustration to say there are a lot of people that would like to get in the classrooms and they don't do it for money.
Okay, right here.
Richard Askey, University of Wisconsin. A comment on Ted Watanabe about the exams. The analog of the SAT math exam. They designed that to aim for a 60% correct response, and actually got about 65%. They look at it each time. So it's not a matter of the questions being that hard. I'd be surprised if we don't aim for something like that. And then I have a plea to the math panel. Mr. Deputy Secretary gave two very, very nice statements about what we ought to be doing, about research on what good teaching is and how to prepare people for teaching. And I would plead to the members of the National Math Panel that something like that would be very useful in the report from the National Math Panel.
Can I just make one comment about the entrance exam? The the particular exam that you gave me the website of, which is really equivalent to SAT, but there are two kinds of entrance exams. That the universities themselves administer entrance exams, and there are many universities, particularly if students are intending to measure in the humanities, they would not even require the mathematics test on that center exams. And that was one of the big concerns raised by Japanese college professors, and in terms of the decline of Japanese students' mathematical achievement level. Part of that may have been facilitated by the fact that these universities are no longer requiring the mathematics portion of this equivalent of SAT test from the students who want to take their entrance exam at their own universities.
Okay, let's go from back to front. Yeah.
My name is Atman Al-Suki. I'm from Cisco Systems. I have two questions. Question number one, what is the role of the private sector in the different countries, and what should be this role here in the state? Question number two, it's what's the role of the technology? How do you see the technology help the students and the teachers, especially in the area of professional development?
Might as well just go around.
Okay, on the role of the private sector in China, the private sector at the K-12 level is relatively small. I'm trying to think what numbers I've seen on it, but it is growing, particularly in the cities, particularly in middle-class areas. And for Chinese who've had experience overseas and might want a school that reflects both a mixture of what's good about Chinese education and what's good about Western education. I think at first the Chinese resisted it, but they now see it as inevitable. And because they don't believe that the state is going to be able to fund everything, I mean, they have in mind a massive expansion of the higher education system to the point where between now and 2020, to the point where they'll have the same proportion of the cohort going on to higher education that we do here. Whether or not they meet that, there's no way they can do that just out of government funding in the traditional way. So the private sector is going to, both non-profit and for-profit, is going to develop a lot. And I might just contrast India, where I think more than 60% of the students are now in non-government schools. That's not a positive policy on the part of government. That's parents, both middle class and lower income parents, abandoning the poor government schools for a range of private schools of very varying quality. So for them, how you manage a school system that has a huge private and community-based component is a big policy issue they're struggling with.
Excuse me, I'm not looking at the private schools, I'm looking at private companies. Okay. Since the recipient of the school system in the future is going to be employees, which will impact these private companies.
I don't have any very hard data on that. I can tell you, talking to business people in China, that they will complain that they don't have much input into the Chinese Ministry of Education and the way in which its policies are set, which are more governed at the university level. I do think at the university level there's a much closer relationship between the universities and business, and you find business-funded laboratories inside university systems. But I can give you the name of the person who has studied that in China. His name is Dennis Simon. He's the provost at the Levin Institute at State University of New York, and he's studying basically the scientific innovation system in China as it's emerging away from a kind of completely government-dominated one to one that has a private sector element.
Okay. This is really my personal observation, not data-based response, but I think as in China, I think the involvement of the private sectors into Japanese public schools is minimal. I have heard some people talk about and the private sector people talk about education systems, and they don't want to see these high schools or even the lower secondary schools to become the vocational prep schools. They would rather see the students educated in the fundamental ways so that they can train their workers to do their business well. And they want the students to be ready to be trained for their business work. So they that view may or may not be similar to what the private sector is in this country holds or not, but I found that to be very interesting perspective. As far as the technology is concerned, I think the Japanese school buildings, I think in the past 10 years or so, the Ministry of Education has put in some money so that the school buildings are connected to the internet and so on, make those computing technology available. And the Japanese teachers are, in general, very proficient with technology, but you don't see as much technology used in the classroom in terms of actual teaching or in the context of a professional development. Although there are some groups of teachers in mathematics, for example, I think, who are very much interested in developing effective way of using technology to teach certain mathematical ideas, and there's a Japanese professors who actually invented some geometry software probably before the Geometry Sketchpad, which becomes very popular in this country, was ever developed. But so there's some pockets of people in Japan, the educators in Japan, who are very much interested in using technology. But I think Japanese teachers tend to be very cautious about incorporating new ideas into the classrooms. They want to make sure that when they do, they want to do it so that they can indeed teach more effectively with the technology.
Private sectors in Korea are very critical to Korean highly standardized education system. Actually, in Korea, schools can choose students. Korea, there's a very interesting feature of Korean education. It's called the equalization policy, which actually randomly distributes students either to public and private school. So even private schools actually cannot choose students within their school district. So actually the private companies saw this point with this kind of system, which does not allow competitions, school choice, by the students and parents. So they're very critical about this system. So they actually want to move towards more kind of individualized, more kind of, the technological, kind of the learning style. So I think there's lots of things, debates going on in Korea where this system should go. But actually I just stopped in the last slide. But I think there's an interesting question, especially from the sociological perspective, that whether does this move toward individualized education or to create competitions really help these, to address the inequality issues. What I can see in Japanese and Korean education in very recent years is actually there's a growing gap between high achieving and low achieving students, especially now in 2000, in the middle of 2000, after Korean education and Japanese education actually made the move toward this kind of, the individualized education away from standardized education. So I'm not actually kind of, the dependent standardized education system, but there's lots of things actually to think about, kind of potential consequence of this kind of, the educational reform for inequality issues in Korea.
I think in our country, we talk about private companies' investment in education in terms of dollars. It's minuscule compared to the overall support. I mean, schools in this country are funded by tax monies. And approximately 9% comes from the federal government. The other 91% comes from state and local sources. And within the states, the vast majority generally come from state tax funds. So the local community, whatever support it provides, primarily, again, in this nation, has to do with facilities. Private financial support is important to local communities, but it's not going to make or break the school system. Where private industry and private business can leverage their influence is in policy and in passing taxes. If they don't feel in a local community that the schools are responsive to their needs, they're going to work to not pass the taxes to support those schools. So there's a lot of influence private sector can have other than monetary at the local level. Now we have foundations, the Gates Foundation, for example, and a number of others that invests heavily in education research. So there are examples of where there is a lot of money being put in, but if you go down to the local school level, financial support is not that great, but influence is. Technology, I don't think we've seen a lot of studies that tell us just how well technology is translating to student achievement in this country. We've spent a lot of money on technology. I mean, I guess just about every school building in this country is wired for the internet. But what's it translated in terms of student achievement? I think the jury's still out on that. And in fact, our secretary is having dialogue now around the country to trying to get a better answer. What has technology done for student achievement? And what do we need to do to capture harness the power of technology to where it does make a significant difference if in fact it's not now?
Wow. In the back.
My name is Adriana Decanter, and I'm with the U.S. Department of Education, and I have a question for Professor Watanabe. You mentioned that the Georgia standards were based on the Japanese standards, which I guess were the former Japanese standards, and it looked like from your slide presentation that you had done some sort of analysis of the similarity and differences between what might be the true Japanese standards versus what are in the Georgia standards. Have you done such a systematic review of both sets of standards, and if so, would that analysis be available?
I have not really written up any of my analysis. I have, because I teach in the state university, and where one of the mission is to prepare teachers for the state, I have to be familiar with the state standards. So I have read the Georgia standards, and I would not say that Georgia standards is based on the Japanese. I think it's been informed by Japanese standards, but they have also incorporated some of the standards produced by the American Statistical Associations in terms of the data analysis and the statistics study. So when I look at the Georgia standards, I think Georgia standards has much stronger statistics components to it than the Japanese standards do. I primarily work with the elementary school teachers, so I've looked more closely at the K-8 level standards, and K-8 level standards are and the Georgia standards are fairly close to what you would see in Japanese standards, except that the beginning of the elementary grade is different. Elementary school is different. In Japan, there is no academic standards for the kindergarten, whereas in Georgia standards start with kindergarten. So they somehow split the first grade standards in Japanese standards into sort of kindergarten and first grade. But I do see some similarities in terms of the sequence of topics. For example, the fractions are introduced about the same grade level in grade 3 in Japan as in the Georgia standard. Georgia standard, they do some simple things at earlier grades, which Japanese don't. Also, the Georgia standards have these content strands that are numbered operations, geometry, measurement, and then they have data, and then they have algebra, which is basically paralleling to the NCTM standards, but the NCTM standards actually have the algebra standards for the entire K-8 level, but in Georgia they do not introduce algebra strands until grade 3, which is the same way in the Japanese strand. But Japanese standards do not have the data analysis as a separate strand. They actually have a strand called the quantitative relations, which include both data analysis and the algebra. So there's some similarities and differences, and it will be interesting to see how those surface features, surface similarities, whether or not the people who actually look at the standards actually understand the nuances of the Japanese standards, if they actually sort of use that to inform the Georgia standards. Do they really understand the nuances and the subtlety that may exist in these Japanese standards in the treatment of certain topics? That's something that I'm very much interested in finding out in the next few years.
Rose.
Hi, I'm Rose Chen, the Rose Group for Cross-Cultural Understanding. I'm the product of the education system you talk about. I was born and raised in Taiwan, and what you have talked about, Korea, China, brought back a lot of very sad memories. And but I have to say, I want to share just a few of my experience. Education is an equalizer in China for thousands of years. And when I was growing up, it's highly prized if you are a good student and you score high, and then you are encouraged to take science and maths. And in the classroom, the teacher will publish the score. So it's an honor to be tapped to study science and maths, engineering. So that's the environment. And then, of course, there's a lot of memorizations, and you have to memorize the multiplication table, and I hated that. But once you master the skills, you cross that threshold, it sets you free. To this date, I appreciate the fact I can do calculation in my head. I don't need a calculator. Okay, so you talk about science and math, it's logical. So it does help you with problem solving. And with my generation, a lot of the only hope, back then, Taiwan was under martial law. So for the students, there's a motivation. They want to get scholarships so they can come to the United States or outside to get out of there. And for my generation, and currently I can see that from China, once these students, they come to the environment, like U.S. here, their creativity, their problem solving, they thrive because they have mastered the basic, the very fundamental skills. So this is just something I like to share with the panelists, and maybe you have some comments. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say one thing about you started out with saying about you brought back some of the sad memory. When you talk with Japanese teachers, oftentimes what they really strive to do is to create some happy memory for kids. And the Japanese schools are, in many ways, even though academics is very important, academics achievement, academic mastery is very important, especially at the compulsory education level, the elementary and lower secondary level. I think the emphasis is really on educating whole child, educating whole person. And Secretary Simon mentioned about the experience in Rwanda, and the killers were uneducated. But I don't think that uneducated necessarily means educated in math and science. I think it's more than academic education. It's really the whole person education, and developing that kind of respect for each others, and respect for teachers, respect for the cultures of their own as well as others. And those are the kind of things that are very much emphasized in Japanese schools, and especially at the lower grade levels. And Japanese teachers would say that I teach mathematics so that I can help students develop those kinds of characters and values. So they see teaching of the academic subject actually serving the bigger purpose of educating the whole person.
I just wanted to, the sad, I mean, there are lots of people who've been through the Chinese school system who say sad memories, don't want to go. I mean, as economies change, as the educational level of population rises, what appeared good to one generation may not appear good to the next. And so I think what the Chinese are struggling with is how do they keep the respect for teachers, the respect for learning, the focus on high level rigor and performance, not kind of this soft, squishy stuff they see in Western schools, while also broadening the curriculum, giving more choice. So there's a sort of fascinating. I mean, as you know, China's trying to reform its curriculum right now, and there's a huge fight about it. It's going on in a number of the provinces too, because the traditionalists see it as kind of diluting the traditional rigor, while the sort of the modernizers seeing it as adding more elements that might be considered more Western. So all of this is dynamic. No system is static. I just wanted to pick up on something you said about education being an equalizer and going to the career point. One of the things that's interesting about the PISA analyses And incidentally, the new PISA science results will be coming out in December. There's on December the 4th at the National Press Club. And if any of you would like invitations to come to that, just give me your card and I'll make sure you're on the list. But one of the things I find interesting about the PISA analyses from past rounds is not just where countries are in terms of their average distribution, but this issue of are there countries that both have high standards and really use schools as an equalizer versus having high standards but a very wide distribution, which is basically an SES distribution. And I think the US comes in, they've got this kind of matrix, and the US comes down in this mediocre standards and high inequality. I think that's a very interesting kind of notion to try to unpack for us. And I think the kinds of things that the Secretary was talking about in terms of having, if not identical curriculum for everybody, at least core, very clear standards that are true throughout a school and throughout a district is one way to get at that inequality issue.
Sure.
I mean, what I actually want, just, if I just can add one thing, is that many people here, and also many people in the world, see that that there's a cultural value on education in East Asian context. Parents are more involved in children's education. They, highly value education. But from my perspective, it's not an entire story for why actually Korean students, for example, doing well. In order for this kind of cultural norm or cultural value on education to be transmitted for the important factor for students' outcome, actually education system should work somehow to make this cultural norm to be effective for children's education outcome. For example, in the United States, the parents are involved as much as like a Korean parents probably, and they actually value education as much as Korean mothers. But low SS kids don't benefit, from that kind of parental involvement as much as high SS kids. Mm-hmm. Why? Because, the education system is basically so complicated. So there's a lot of things parents are actually have to decide and have to encourage kids to do. So there's a lot of difference in terms of social skills between the different parents. But in Korean education system, actually parental involvement benefit low SS kids much better than high SS kids. In other words, if Korean parents somehow are interested in their kids' education, that actually become important factors to affect the children's education outcome, especially for low SS kids, because of this kind of transparency of the education system that make the low SS parents have less difficulties in navigating the system.
Okay. Any first-time questioners? Okay.
I'm Robert Hershey. I did a math book that's translated into Chinese and Japanese. I wanted to ask about motivating the kids and showing them that the math is something that's going to benefit them and make them more money and make them happier, as opposed to something that's just in the book.
Certainly motivation of children, as I mentioned, I quoted a number of studies, particularly at the high school level, where kids said they weren't motivated. I find the best way to motivate a child is to make sure the child understands the basic concepts. It's hard to motivate a child by the time they get to middle school and they're 3 or 4 years behind in reading, 3 or 4 years behind in math. Get to high school, how do you motivate a child in high school when they can't read and can't do basic math? So part of the motivation is getting that foundation established early. Mm. That'll motivate a child more than any single thing. And a good teacher can make a class interesting, I think.
Hi, my name is Chris Donovan. I'm an Einstein Fellow here with NOAA, and I'm a high school science teacher. I've been teaching for 22 years. And I'd like to direct my question to the enthusiasm that was heard in the room about Teach for America. It's a great program, but it's a Band-Aid. You get kids who, out of high school or out of college, and you promise them to pay off their tuition, a portion of it. You have young kids who are not really chosen their career field, and you say, go teach. Okay, that tells career teachers two things. Number one, it tells them that anybody can teach. And number two, it also tells them that teaching is not a profession, because these kids do it for 2 and 3 years and they're out of there. And I think you're mixing up enthusiasm for expertise in a lot of factors. So I'd like to hear some comments about that.
Well, I'm not the salesperson for Teach for America, but I can tell you this: nobody has more respect for teachers than I do. I went through the traditional system. I have a lot of respect for that. But the realities are that our traditional system is not producing the numbers and qualities of teachers that we need, particularly in math, science, foreign language, critical foreign language, special education. The traditional system is not producing the teachers. So do we open school with substitutes? Do we not open school in some cases because we don't have teachers? Or are we willing to look for more non-traditional avenues for teachers? I don't think it disrespects the teacher if we find a physicist or a physician that wants to teach biology or teaches physics and they haven't been through the traditional system. Certainly they can't just walk into the classroom. I think the Unabomber had a PhD in physics, didn't he? We don't want that person
and he used it
in something. We don't want that person in front of a classroom. I know a number of physicians and engineers that would probably not survive middle school at all more than 1 or 2 days. So it's not just they walk in off the street. They have to receive training of some kind. I'm a strong believer in the non-traditional system, but strong believer that some training has to occur. But too often we just say, we're not. It's thrown like a fraternity. I had to get hazed, so by golly, somebody else is going to have to get hazed too. And I think we can't go through that and say just because someone hasn't been through a traditional college teacher preparatory system, they're not fit to teach in schools, or it demeans the teachers that are there. There's a way of marrying those two together. We've got too many needs out there to be fighting over who trains them and who doesn't, as long as they're trained and effective. That's why I think we're going to have to start turning our attention more to effective teachers as opposed to just highly qualified teachers. Highly qualified does open a lot of loopholes there on what's qualified and what's not. As effective is the child learning. Is that teacher teaching those children? Is student achievement going up because that person's in the classroom or not? That's the question we ought to be asking more about.
Okay, there's only time for one more question, but I think I can't speak for the secretary because I assume he's busy, but our other panel can stay a little bit if you want to come up after we close this off. Okay, last question.
Hi, my name's Ruth McDonald. I'm from Oregon. I've been a teacher for 28 years at all levels, K through 12, most recently middle school math and science. I wanted to ask anybody who wanted to address it. It seems to me that one of our problems in the U.S. is, as compared to the Asian countries, is they do have national standards and everything is in alignment with them, their teacher training and their textbooks and their curriculum. And here we have standards, but they're not uniform from state to state. And not only are they not uniform, but every state can decide on what the passing level is going to be. And recently there was an article a couple of weeks ago about a school in Mississippi that all the students made AYP, even though on the NAEP test they only scored at the 18th percentile level. So what do we do about the differences among our states when we've got no uniformity and no standard for the standard?
Sounds like a U.S. question.
From a political standpoint, which is what this country is all about in terms of education, the federal government has no role in its Constitution on teaching kids. It's a state function. The fact that No Child Left Behind is as aggressive as it is, providing only 9% of the financial support, we've had significant pushback from folks that think we're being too intrusive now. A national standard right now is politically impossible. Won't happen. What the department did a few months ago now, conducted a little survey where we tried to compare using NAEP as a standard, where we mapped out, I believe, wasn't all the states, but a number of states, we mapped out the relative strength of state standards compared to the NAEP. That's generated a lot of discussion. I think there is some interest in national standards. in my opinion, again, that's not a politically viable thing here. So the best we can do, as I think we're doing, is try to point out, using some standard that people recognize, and NAEP is that standard. NAEP is it's governed by a separate board that is not supposed to be influenced by politics. They design the exam, they set the standards. Voluntary standards, voluntary benchmarks, some type of national benchmark like NAEP, where then the public is informed. If I'm living in Mississippi, and I'm not saying your statistics are right or wrong, but let's assume they're right. If I'm living in Mississippi and I see a standard published that my child was proficient, or that X% were proficient on the state test and only 18% were proficient on NAEP, I'd be asking some questions. I don't know that I'd be saying I want to change the standards, but I'd be asking questions. And at least you know where they stand. A number of states are beginning, particularly in math, to join together with the consortium of states to adopt common standards. Achieve, that particular organization is doing a lot with consortium of states to try to set standards. I know the chief state school officers are doing some discussions among themselves about how they can do voluntary standards among themselves. That's the best hope we have of any kind of standardization, or increasing the rigor, or at least getting the debate out there about the difference in rigor among state standards. And pay attention to the National Math Panel's report. There's going to be unless we screw up bad, this is going to be an excellent opportunity, not going to be a national standard, but it's going to set a blueprint about what kids ought to know. And it'll be flexible enough that states can accommodate it. But it'll be sufficient enough, in my opinion, to say this is what a kid has to know and be able to do well in algebra. If you do well in algebra, the world is yours.
Could I comment on the standards issue from a kind of an international perspective?
Sure.
I do think the national standards issue has kind of come to the fore in part because of these international analyses, because they all show that the high-performing systems have very clear standards, and so that's partly why it's got into the conversation. But it's not the only thing. I mean, people tend to treat it as a silver bullet. There are many other elements of those systems that make it effective. But the other thing that's interesting, well, there are a couple of other things that are interesting from an international perspective. There are other federal systems that manage to have a common standard, usually by the provinces or the states coming together and establishing it, so that because they're concerned about regional inequality. So it's possible to have a national standard that is not a federal standard. I forget what the second thing